Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second tutorial session of the afternoon. My name is Luke Stark. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, and Ethics group in Microsoft Research Montreal. I'm delighted to be the session chair for this session, which means I will handle the mic and put out any fires that might come up. So this is a set of two 45-minute tutorials. They are not connected, so you're welcome to rotate after the first, although I suggest you stay for both because they're both fantastic. The first tutorial will go until 3:45, and at 3:45 we'll switch. And that first tutorial is titled Towards the Theory of Race from Fairness in Machine Learning, and it's being presented by Emanuel Moss from the CUNY Graduate Center.
Hi, everybody. My name is Emanuel Moss, or Manny, some of you know me as. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and one of the things anthropology pays attention to is how social values vary and shift over time and from place to place. So part of my ethnographic work for my dissertation project has been looking at data science and machine learning and studying how fairness has emerged as an important value through the work of people at this conference and the associated workshops that deal with fairness. As I've conducted this research, I've observed that another central concern for anthropology, how people make sense of diversity, plays an important role in this conversation around algorithmic fairness. What I want to try to do today is to translate social scientific approaches to race, particularly those that come out of critical race theory, into terms that are relevant for algorithmic fairness. Along the way, we'll talk about possible definitions of race, how race is socially embedded, how race functions as a classification and categorization system, and how taking up the task of thinking about race as it comes to us from social science, how taking that up in a nuanced and thoughtful way can help maybe invigorate some of the questions that the FAT community asks. So what I've noticed is that within the FAT conversations, there are lots of ways to talk about fairness. Arvin did a tutorial last year that had 21 definitions of fairness, but I think he calculated maybe like 600 more beyond that. But there's a less robust vocabulary available to talk about the categories that fairness has been aimed at. I've also noticed that there are strong intuitions about the relationship between fairness and protected categories, but that these intuitions are not always clear. So what I'm going to try and do today is supply some language to help think through these ideas. What I want to suggest is that while it's important to define fairness with respect to race, or sex, gender, sexuality, age, disability, etc., efforts to achieve fairness might benefit if we also work towards a definition of race or gender, sexuality, race, disability, etc., especially what we mean by race as it pertains to particular contexts in which an algorithmic system is deployed. Because the significance or meaning of race shifts and refracts from one context to another, being deliberate about how we think about race might be able to help, if not resolve, but perhaps make more informed choices about some of the necessary trade-offs that crop up when defining fairness in one way or another. For example, privileging group fairness might emerge as a better solution to a problem if we think about race in one context, while privileging individual fairness might emerge as a better solution where the legacy of race in that context is different. I also want to suggest that the intuitions we rely on about fairness and race might benefit from being held up and inspected, allowing us to think about why we believe, say, that skin tone and accuracy of a facial recognition system should be independent of each other, and also that it might help to formalize some of these intuitions. I made that. I know this is an overgeneralization, but because there's been some very important work on how some features can serve as proxies for race. But for the sake of this tutorial, I want to point out that all too often, race is understood as whatever goes in that column. We think about fairness between different entries in the column, but we don't necessarily have a good operating definition for what phenomenon in the world this column is referring to. So let's try to think about what race is for machine learning and for fairness. You with me? All right. So just for a minute or two, sit quietly, think to yourselves about what race is as you understand it. Just get the brain going. Given the matter some thought? Anybody need more time? Okay. Before we get going into the meat of the presentation, I just want to flag a couple notes. One, this tutorial is intended to translate concepts from social science and critical race theory into questions for the FAC community. We're not trying to answer anything necessarily today, but to generate a set of provocative questions to move forward with. The goal is not to produce rigid definitions or make sweeping claims, but to help guide work to make it more fair, transparent, and accountable with respect to race. Also, a disclaimer, this tutorial will focus on race, but many of the questions it generates could also apply to other protected categories that describe human difference, like sex, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nationality, etc. But we should also keep in mind throughout that social categories are best thought of as intersectional. Whiteness is different for a white man than for a white woman, and it's different for a rich white woman than it is for a poor white woman in important ways. Social categories are produced through complex interactions across all the various loci of identity, which can't easily be isolated from interaction effects. And there's significant gaps that arise from how anti-discrimination policies treat gender discrimination and racial discrimination, for example, when they intersect. So today's discussion will build towards intersectional understandings without explicitly addressing intersectionality. But I'd encourage everyone to, when I post these slides, click on that link and look at the wealth of amazing literature on the topic of intersectionality. I don't want to suggest that there's a single authoritative definition of race. I do, however, want to put forward a tentative definition and inspect it to see what kind of insights we can glean from thinking deeply about what race is or might be. Moving forward towards a theory of race, I think it's important that any definitions that get adopted are also tentative and hopefully generative of new insights as they're examined and reworked. Okay, so when I've taught the topic of race in an undergrad course, I tend to give this as a tentative definition to be examined and to motivate discussion and open-ended questionings. And I think it's as good a place as any to start today, at least to get us all on the same page for a conversation. Here, Faye Harrison describes race as something that can be understood as an ideologically charged distinction in social stratification and as a social and often legal classification applied to people presumed to share common physical or biological traits. So let's unpack this. In this definition, Faye Harrison describes working towards an understanding of race. We're already a step removed from defining race itself and instead trying to understand race as a concept. I'd also like to say that race is more of an understanding than it is a tangible property, and we'll get into that more in a bit. People hold an understanding of race in their heads and act in the world based upon that understanding. If we think of race as an understanding, we can start to think about what kind of ideas about race people hold in their heads, and we can also think about how those ideas influence the way people act in the world. Race can be understood as an ideologically charged distinction. The ideas people hold in their heads about race are the basis for distinguishing between people, particularly for distinguishing between groups or kinds of people, in scare quotes. As we'll see in a second, these distinctions are ideologically charged in part because they depend on a particular understanding of human difference, but also because they underwrite a system of power, as can be seen by looking at the period of history when race was becoming a salient concept for making sense of the world. Race can be understood as an ideologically charged distinction in social stratification. I think everyone in this room would agree that no group of people is better or worse than another prima facie, but that wasn't always a consensus view. Without turning this into a history lecture, I want to point out that the modern concept of race emerged at a time when the European colonial project was in full swing and colonial authorities were casting about for reasons to justify their rule over distant colonial possessions. Race served as a concept that could distinguish between groups of people, separating the ruled from the rulers, and it also wound up leveraging evolutionary theories to establish a hierarchy that placed white Europeans as more advanced, capable, and developed than darker-skinned colonial residents, justifying European rule over them. This stratification and ranking played out in many ways, subtle and overt, from the explicit paternalism of the white man's burden in the Rudyard Kipling poem to objective-seeming infographic-like representations in academic treatises that place lighter-skinned groups spatially, literally, above darker-skinned races. This is from a natural history textbook from the period. Race can be understood as an ideologically charged distinction in social stratification and as a social and often legal classification. It's hard to have stratification without classification. And one of the issues at the heart of algorithmic fairness is classification. Deciding what categories are and what fits into those categories should be seen as an active and ongoing process that changes from one historical moment to the next and from one cultural context to the next. I want to flag two ideas here. The first comes from Omi and Wynand and points out that the impulse to categorize people is about as close as we come to a human universal, but that the categories themselves are by no means universal and fixed. They change over time, and the meanings and values associated with particular categories do as well. The second point I want to make is about how much work goes into producing and maintaining these categories, and about how easily that work disappears from view. Racial categories sometimes conflate or sit uneasily between other categorizations like ethnicity, ancestry, nationality, and genetic population. And the way race is constituted in relation to these other concepts shifts over time too, in politically charged and power-laden ways. Lee Starr and Jeff Bowker cover a lot of ground on this topic in their book Sorting Things Out, but for our purposes today, what I want to show is that any system of classification, including but not limited to racial classification, is the product of a great deal of work that goes on into deciding what goes in and what gets left out of any particular category. How society deals with edge cases plays a role in deciding what constitutes the categories themselves. And we can think about 19th century and early 20th century debates about what percentage of parentage might determine someone's race, like the one-drop rule versus any fractional rule as a legal category. And we can also think about how fraught that categorization might be for someone whose legal rights depend on falling into one bucket in that categorization or another. Bowker and Starr, in Sorting Things Out, also point out how these categories torque individuals as they negotiate for a place within the classification system. They try to position themselves so they hold a favorable spot within a classificatory system, emphasizing one feature or another of their identity based on legal or folk understandings of that classification system, or play the inevitable gaps in that system off of each other to gain a favorable positioning. The reactivity and feedback loops of classification systems that Bowker and Starr discuss have important lessons for interpretability and transparency as well as fairness, I think. What I'm talking about is the tendency of people to try to affect how they are classified. They react in response to a classificatory system. And so from this perspective, an algorithmic system doesn't just sort people into, say, those who get job interviews and those who don't, but it also produces effects beyond that as people manipulate their own behavior online and offline to be seen differently by the classifier as they understand it. And this is the way classificatory systems have played out historically as well. Back to the definition. Race can be understood as an ideologically charged distinction in social stratification and as a social and often legal classification applied to people presumed to share. I want to think about what it means to presume that a racial group shares anything in common at all. If we think about this deeply, it might start to trouble some of our assumptions about how we sort people into racial groups, how we think about features in data sets that serve as proxies for race, and especially how we think about generalizations that we make about race. To what extent are racial groupings universal? In what context might a racial grouping be apt? Where are exceptions likely to crop up? Why do some features covary with race? Under what conditions does this covariance hold? And why or why not? I want to suggest that this might be incredibly important for how we think about fairness with respect to race. Race can be understood as an ideologically charged distinction in social stratification and as a social and often legal classification applied to people presumed to share common physical or biological traits. To demonstrate how poorly race generalizes and to show how much the concept of race relies on presumptions and ideas rather than objective measures, let's look at some of the presumptions that underlie a physical or biological basis for race. I'm going to do the hard and fast version of this bit of the lecture, trying to kind of pop the bubble that surrounds a biological basis of race by looking at some of the common presumptions. But this is the hard and fast version. We're going to skip over a lot here. So what's the argument against a biological basis for race? The top level argument is that while we think of race as natural, the way we divide up natural variation in human beings, it relies on culturally defined boundaries. And the boundaries between these categories change over time. Anthony Appia says that however you define the major races, the biological variability within them is almost as great as the biological variation within the species as a whole. He says that while there are some characteristics that we're very good at recognizing, skin color, hair, skull shape, that are very unevenly geographically distributed, the groups produced by these assignments do not cluster much for other characteristics. We emphasize certain features, hair, eye color, nose shape, et cetera, while we ignore other features that might have as much variation in the human population, like the shape of a hand, the ratio of arm to leg length, et cetera. And also these racial categories change over time. Jews, Italians, Irish were not understood as white in the 19th century, but today they are commonly understood as white. And the legal basis for these categories shifts over time. The legal basis for blackness in Florida was 1/8 of your parentage, whereas in Haiti it was 1/16. That is, depending on where you were on the planet, determined what race you were for some people. Like I said, this is the hard and fast version of this. We can get into this more if we really want to, but I would encourage anybody who has more interest in this to look at National Geographic's long-form rebuttal. In their article, they actually do a pretty good job examining the scientific basis of race, especially in the context of the Human Genome Project. And I'll link to this in the slides as well. Okay, so this is the definition as we've held it up tentatively. It's arguing against a biological basis for race, and it's also arguing against an objective basis for race. Whatever measures we have used to determine race have not been objective measures or features, but rather have been culturally determined, and they vary from one social context to the next. Okay, so while I hope I've started to unsettle or undermine an objective basis for race, I in no way want to suggest that race isn't real. Race has real effects on the world and profoundly structures life opportunities in ways that show up in much of the data that we work with. Race is the result of arbitrary cultural boundaries, and it's real in the way that it shapes experiences of ourselves and of others. And it's also the basis of a system of material relations between people. It structures how rights and resources have been allocated. I want to give a very micro-level example that will hopefully show how deeply ingrained these are and kind of accumulate to a much more structural effect. So maybe some of you have seen this slide before, but these are two photographs taken during Hurricane Katrina that circulated in the popular press. They're pretty similar in subject matter, right? We can agree these are similar photos. Let's look at how these photos were captioned. Do you see the difference in the way these were captioned? Do you see it now? This is a good example of the implicit bias of the caption writer showing, for sure. But it's also more than that. Implicit bias is at play in how we perceive the world, but it also often reproduces a worldview, as the caption writer's worldview is reproduced here, and perpetuates or reinforces bias amongst the readers of the caption in barely perceptible but in non-negligible ways. This slots into the kinds of representational harms that I've heard Kate Crawford talk about in the past, and I want to hold up Sophia Noble's work on algorithms of oppression as a masterclass in how this can happen at scale in networked data infrastructures. What I want to suggest here, and this should be no great surprise to those of us in the room, but what I want to suggest is that inequality exists along racial lines. The inequality that exists along racial lines is produced and reinforced through a process in which race has been a meaningful basis for excluding some people from opportunities afforded to others. I think that's what fairness is trying to solve against in a lot of cases. This plays out in symbolic ways, like in newspaper captions, but also in material ways, like in housing policies, hiring decisions, and policing. These symbolic and material forms reinforce each other, and while their historical origins might seem distant to us today, they have entailed effects that are still measurable in the data sets we work with. I hope it's somewhat straightforward, although there are stacks of other studies we could point to see how over a lifetime of these bias-laden messages and choices and classifications, it can affect people as to how they're perceived by society, as well as how people perceive themselves as they move through the world. And this has profound effects on things like job prospects, housing searches, interactions with police, educational attainment, health, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just that race fuels implicit bias is kind of the takeaway here, but it's that race and implicit bias are engaged in a feedback loop that has real material consequences. Okay. So this is why we can't think of race as just one feature amongst others. It's not enough to think about race as whatever populates the field race in whatever data set you're working with. And actually, the FACT community has done a really good job identifying the ways in which race gets coded into other features within the data set, how things like income and zip code can serve as proxies for race. But one thing I want to suggest today is that we actually need to think not only about how things like education, income, and zip code can co-vary with race in particular contexts, we also need to think about why they co-vary in the ways they do. I want to suggest that these features aren't just proxies for race, they're also the product of race. Understanding structural racism can show the ways in which race and other features co-produce each other. It can show the ways in which the material relations that are produced by race have an effect on one's life chances. I also want to acknowledge here the good work coming out of the FACT community without naming names to prevent these proxy features from producing discriminatory classifiers using a variety of methods. But it's important to go another step further to understand why these efforts don't quite redress the structural unfairness of racism. Just as an example of one of these approaches, I'd like to discuss how counterfactual fairness can actually be a troublesome idea. Counterfactually fair decisions give the same result as an individual would receive if they belonged to a different racial group, all else being equal. There's other versions of counterfactual fairness, but I think this is a good short-of-hand definition. But what I'd like to say is that if someone had always belonged to a different demographic group, then most every data point we have about them would also be different, as all of those data points are at least partially the outcome of having lived in the world as a person who belongs to a particular demographic group. This is how Isa Kohler-Hausman puts it. The problem with identifying discrimination with the treatment effect of race is that it misrepresents what race is and how it produces effects in the world, and concomitantly what makes discrimination because of race a moral wrong. In the classic counterfactual causal inference framework, race can be a treatment on units only if manipulating it does not entail fundamental changes to other aspects of that unit. I hope that by encouraging us to grapple with what race is, we can better understand how race produces effects in the world and shapes the inferences we make about those effects, given a more nuanced understanding of race. I'm going to let Isa say a couple more words here to kind of drive this point home, because I think it's worth repeating. Race cannot be reconceptualized as an isolated treatment in the counterfactual causal model, and accordingly, racial discrimination cannot be defined as the treatment effect of race. If we accept the constructivist theory of race, then we must reject attempts to detect racial discrimination that seek to isolate the causal effect of race alone, because it rests on a sociological incoherent conception of what race references and how it can cause a distinctive form of action called discrimination. So what I hope has come through today is a more sociologically coherent conception of race, or at least an impetus to work towards a coherent conception of what race is as it acts in the world. So the key takeaways I'd like to leave this tutorial with before we open this up to a larger conversation is a suggestion that race is constituted in highly variable ways that differ from one context to the next. The work of classification contributes in an ongoing and evolving way to how race is understood, and race is not independent of other variables. Its effects cannot easily be isolated. And I think if we think of these as key takeaways, they generate a set of questions for the FACT community to kind of puzzle over ourselves. To what extent can we learn race from images or structured data? What presumptions does learning race entail? Under what conditions do these presumptions hold? How might a classifier change the behavior of those who interact with it? And to what extent are those behavioral changes likely to vary along racial lines? Do classification systems produce racial effects? And how do we think about the relationship between features in a data set if we understand them as co-produced with race? Now, the title of this tutorial is Towards a Theory of Race for Fairness in Machine Learning. So I have a set of provocations that I'd like us to think about as constitutive elements of a theory of race in this room today, at least to get started on this conversation. So I'd like to suggest that a theory of race should have a tentative definition of how to understand race, as well as a robust articulation of what race is not. I think a theory of race should also include a consideration of power, agency and reactivity, history and context, as well as biology. Who draws the lines between racial groups? By what power are they able to do so? How is group membership determined and who is doing the determining? What discretion do individuals have over how they are represented in data sets? And how might people respond to being treated as members of one group or another? How is the historical legacy of race relevant? Will the future look like the present? Does race work the same way across an entire domain? Does race work the same in Atlanta as it does in New York, as it works in Chicago, as it works in Beijing, as it works in Jakarta? And is race serving as a proxy for biological variation? If so, what are the limitations of this approach? And how are sociocultural distinctions different from biomedical distinctions? So these are the kinds of questions I'd like us to start talking with each other about today. I'm happy to answer questions, but I think the rest of the time might be best spent talking to each other about these ideas in a constructive way, if that's all right with you. Shall we?
Okay. We should first of all thank Manny. So I will handle the mic. I assume there'll be many comments and questions, so please try to keep your comments brief. We have exactly 15 minutes to have a conversation, which is not a lot of time for this topic. So I'm going to start right here.
So, okay, I'm a computer scientist, so the question may be completely wrong, formulated in a wrong manner, but most of what you have said to me applies to gender, doesn't it? So, and to national origin, the income of my parents, like many other categories. Up to what point should we look into these distinctions and just say, okay, perhaps there is a problem of a higher level about this type of categories?
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. That's absolutely true. I wanted to focus on race because it's very present in a lot of the work that happens in this community, but it's absolutely true that we can look at gender and sex and sexuality and ethnicity as similar kinds of construction that open up the exact same kinds of questionings and that they interact in complex ways. And I think the intersectionality literature actually does get at that. As you read into it. But I wanted to kind of bracket out race for this conversation. And I think that whatever we think today with about race, we can also think with for these other protected categories. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mona Stone, I'm also a sociologist, not
Hey.
a computer scientist. What do you think can be done in terms of computer science, pedagogy, and this is for the room, to bring these kinds of questions into the material of data science quite literally?
Yeah, I'm not going to answer that. That's for the room.
All right, well.
Does anybody want to respond to that?
Immediate responses on that point? Maybe. Oh, okay. You have a question? Okay, you have a question. Are there, yeah, so any, okay, yes.
Hi, my name is Bruce Haynes. I'm a sociologist at UC Davis. It seems to me the challenge is disentangling the socially embeddedness of race from the identity category, right? So, the census imposed race and as a result orchestrated the sorting mechanisms that we talked about. And that created structurally based inequality. So that's what makes race socially embedded.
Mm-hmm.
We then ask people to select their identity from the social location. And so when we treat race as an identity category, we're ignoring the socially embeddedness And we're also ignoring the fundamental asymmetry between white and black categories, for instance, of race. I would also suggest that focusing on the biology of race, which was, again, part of the imposed nature of the category through the one-drop rule, misconstrues the arbitrariness of the category, where color is actually irrelevant to the category, and it's a social process by which one is determined whether or not you are in the category or not in the category. So I think the key challenge for data scientists is to disentangle what we're calling identity and treating identity as if they're equal, gender identities with race identities with ethnic identities, when in fact these are different socially embedded distinctions.
I think that's super helpful. Does anybody else want to add to that or further respond to the question from the floor?
I'm gonna go here because you had your hand up. To respond to that one?
Hi, I'm Maike Zillicke from TU Berlin, and I'm also a computer scientist, and I wanted to ask to this, what you were just proposing, if, what my work is a lot about finding algorithms that mitigate differences in visibility for different socially salient groups. And so there is this dilemma, I think, between actually you don't want to have these attributes. You don't, and I'm also from Germany, so actually having this feature race is very problematic for me when I work with it historically. And so I am wondering if can we ignore it? Can we say like people can choose their identity? Because if you want to do programs that kind of, for example, if you do algorithms that try to have equal visibility across groups, you need some kind of category for the algorithm somehow. Maybe you don't, but I don't know yet how not. And how would you respond to that? That on the one hand you don't want to have it, and on the other one you kind of need it in order to optimize for better visibility of people who have been denied opportunity in the past.
Do you want to respond to that? Or? Yeah. Brief response, then we'll go back to the back.
I guess my response is exactly what you suggested, that you can't ignore race. It must be explicit, and it must be explicitly accounted for the disadvantage. And the historical precedent has been to treat race as colorblind, quote unquote, to ignore race. And I would suggest that we simply reproduce inequality through ignoring race, which is what data science has been doing recently. So I think the only way to respond is, in fact, to explicitly deal with the socially embedded inequality that race signifies, and not to continue to treat it as an identity category.
Luke, can we go in the back? Yeah. Can we go in the back?
Hi, thanks. My name is Hannah Sassaman. I'm a community organizer based out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania at a group called Media Mobilizing Project. And I just wanted to say, we just had the tutorial in this room right before this focused on community governance of, in particular, about risk assessment algorithms in pretrial. So quite a narrow application, but it dealt deeply with this, making sure that the community is judged by algorithms like this. Often, in the case of pretrial, it's, at least in a city like Philly, it's overwhelmingly black, brown, immigrant, poor, queer people in different cases, actually have structural power in partnership with data science to get the translation, to understand what they're doing or what they're saying, and then to have power over what they're doing. So that's one corrective that we think is important when you can't pull the algorithms totally out of the system. And we talked a bunch about that in the last session, which was recorded if you weren't able to come.
Other hands.
I would like to make a connection between the comment that was made here about the need to disentangle all the causes and effects of what's going on, and the comment that Emanuel made earlier about the criticism towards counterfactual fairness. How can we reconcile those two things? Because my understanding of what's behind the argument for counterfactual fairness is largely an attempt to do precisely that, to try to disentangle the web, the complex web of cause and effect relationships that you have permeated the entire system. You know, could you, Emanuel, maybe respond to that?
Yeah, actually, before I like spit out whatever my superficial sociology take is there anybody who has thought deeply about counterfactuals that would like to engage with this? Anybody? Okay. So yes, you make, so counterfactual reasoning does try to do some of this. Oh, please, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand. I'm sorry.
Just as a computer scientist.
Please, yeah.
I did an experiment where I suggested counterfactual fairness a couple of years before people called it that, and then I went away from that because I thought the whole exercise was completely silly. I didn't actually see these reasons that you brought forward that are very much discussed in the current state, which I think are very relevant. But I think there are other things in that counterfactual discourse. First of all, it's a very narrow idea of counterfactuality. There's a lot more interesting counterfactuality going on in actual court cases and court judgments. Secondly, some of the things are just plain silly. You know, if you'd been 5 years younger, then you would have gotten the loan. And other things are just plain unethical. You know, and making suggestions to people to change their religion or whatever, right? And so we get into a question of what is we're talking to people in a certain form of agency, and it's very individualized. You can change your lot. If only you were to change yourself, then everything would be rosy for you. And disentangling all the suggestions that are being made for people as an isolated person standing up against the whole machinery of structures to change themselves, that in itself is a very problematic thing.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Go.
Yeah, I guess to answer your question about why, so I don't think counterfactual fairness really makes sense either. So as an example, I would say, I think, Manny had said this idea that race is co-produced, right? There's nothing prior. It's not the case that race is sort of prior to a later fact, a later social fact about you. As an illustration of this, you might think, if you have someone who was born in a segregated neighborhood, what is the counterfactual? Let's say they live in a predominantly black neighborhood. What is the correct counterfactual to ask there? Is it the white person born in the same segregated neighborhood, in the overwhelming black neighborhood? Is it the same person with white parents in the segregated neighborhood? Is the counterfactual the white person in the overwhelmingly segregated white neighborhood? The way that we have decided what that other counterfactual is not about detecting the counterfactual. It's about stipulating the counterfactual. There's no sense in which you're detecting the effect of race there. And you might think, okay, well now I can account for the structural disadvantage. I think part of that kind of moves the question back one more, which is you're accounting for the structural disadvantage. What does that count? Which ones are we counting as structural disadvantages? And I don't think you're detecting that. You're putting that into the model. There's nothing about exposing the counterfactual. You're stipulating it, and you're kind of in the process assuming what is or is not discrimination, what is or is not an effect of race. There's nothing empirical about it.
All right, are there other questions or comments? Oh, on the other side, okay.
I can yell.
No, well,
There's
we're
an audience
taping
at
it, so
home.
we want to make sure we have it on tape.
One thing about the spreadsheet that you showed, I think in a lot of cases, and I think this issue did come up before, the reason that label is there is because someone assigned it to themselves on some form or other. So there's actually kind of a interactive process there of deciding how to label yourself. And of course now, at least in many sort of similar forms in the US, there's like decline to state or so forth. And I think that just adds to the complexity of including and accounting for, labels like that in the data.
Yes, can I just tack on one point to that, and then we'll open this back up to the room. Certainly, self-identification is one way we get data for that field, right? But I might extend your question to ask where there are race-blind approaches to classification, and they try to determine if there is a disparate effect along racial lines. How do you think about those efforts to try and learn race as a proxy of other features then? Like, what to make of other evidence for racial disparities within a data set, even if there isn't an explicit category for self-identified race in those cases?
Well, in general.
Yeah, I can.
Can I respond to that? Because I'd like to suggest that that's actually a recent phenomenon that we've made race self-selection. And that self-selection is piggybacking off of, more than 75 years of imposed ascription of the term, right? And so to treat it as an identity category now, when we had not just ascription of the term, but segregation that also contributed to wealth inequality, contributed to health inequality, that there's no way we can simply treat it as an identity category at this stage. And that's part of the problem.
So it's now, my watch 3:44, so we have one, I'm gonna take one more comment, and then we're gonna thank the room and Manny.
Thank you very much. My name is Tanya. I'm a researcher at Tilburg University. I think the questions we ask are very important, and I see an elephant in the room. And my question is this: can AI account for structural inequalities? And if so, how could it go about doing so? And a related question is why, whatever fairness definitions computer scientists are now discussing, do not also consider how fairness relates to tackling historical injustices that affect everybody in different ways. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want a last word?
Thank you for that last comment. Thank you all for all of the comments. I really appreciate this discussion. I hope it was useful.
Thanks.